Hello, hello. My name is Megan Villar. I'm with a company called Full Send, and I get the honor of welcoming you to Denver Startup Week. This is our 13th year putting this event on, and just incredible to see, yes, how the event has grown over time, but also just how our city has grown. As a tech hub for new companies, for innovation, for creativity. So I'm very glad you all are here. I hope today you learned something new, whether it's from these incredible leaders up here or just from even the person sitting next to you. So I encourage you to say hi. And thank you for our incredible sponsors for making this event happen. So with that, I'm thrilled to welcome our panel, Finance Unfiltered. So welcoming to the stage, Roman Villar, Stacy Feldman, and Jesse Randall.
What's going on? So thanks for coming to this session. We actually intentionally took CPA off of our names to not scare anybody away. But the intent here is to have a conversation about finance, the highs and lows of running a startup, and some war stories, some victories, and everything in between. So hopefully you get something out of that. We'll have some Q&A at the end if you want to save some questions. But without further ado, to provide some context, I've got two wonderful people here that I've spent a lot of time with and have come to know over the past number of years. So, can you give a little bit of your background, Stacy Feldman?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Stacy Feldman. I am a CPA, but we like to think of ourselves as more fun CPAs. I started my career at PopSockets up in Boulder. I had a kind of crazy situation where I was the first employee there straight out of school. So we grew the company over a course of about 6 years when I was there from 0 to 300 million. So I kind of sat in that finance seat between 1 and number 3 in the finance department. We went through kind of in startup stage all the way through exploring an IPO. So there's quite a bit of history and knowledge in that phase. Now I'm working alongside Roman at Full Send Finance, where we help startups. So we do outsource finance, accounting, and data for early stage growth companies, 0 to about 20 million in revenue. So I get to take my knowledge and help a bunch of different startups in the space today.
Thanks. How about you, Jesse?
Yeah, nice to meet everybody. Glad to be here. My name is Jesse Randall. I'm the CEO of Sweater. We're a fintech company that helps to launch funds out to the general public. And I guess I've become financially relevant in a lot of different ways. I have a master's degree in entrepreneurial finance and came out and more practically got into the world of fund finance for venture capital funds, forecasting for, for startups and getting companies off the ground. And now I've more recently become an expert in registered fund finance, so mutual funds and things like that. It's a very different type of finance. So. And we happen to work very closely with these professionals over here. So,
thanks for being here. Let's start, Stacy. You said you were the first employee at PopSocket. So assembling how many people have a PopSocket? Like what, 70%? Yeah. Assembling them in a garage is what Stacy was doing a number of years ago, and then helping lead the company through 9 figures in revenue. From the point in time that you started to when you left, let's reflect on the journey of where the finance department started and how you started to get that off the ground.
Well, like many startups, everything kind of comes out of necessity, what needs to get done today. And the finance function was essentially that in the early days. Mind you, I was also fresh out of college, so I had no perspective, no knowledge, thinking as a accounting graduate that I knew was everything. And you get into the business and you learn quickly that there's just things that you've never been exposed to before. So as many people can probably relate, in the early stages, it's do what needs to get done today, and that was invoice customers, pay for your inventory, hire people, get insurance. It was very basic things that we needed to do in the early stage. But because we grew so quickly, we very quickly brought in talented and resourceful people based on our growth stage. So, we brought in a very qualified controller and a CFO. And as we started to mature into that next stage, that's where we started to mature the finance function as well. And a lot of that involved new systems, new softwares, integrating different departments together. That was a huge thing where we had multiple different teams across finance, ops, product, marketing, and everyone's kind of running in their own direction across the company. But we all needed to work together. So centralizing kind of a project management function and setting corporate goals so we all understood how those different roles were really dependent on one another and how my work in finance helped the operations team. We started to mature a bit into just setting those bigger picture objectives and all working collectively together towards those goals. Alongside that, it was, how do we stay financed? Do we have a banking relationship? You know, we were successful enough that we had great choices in the banking partnerships that we had. So let's go out, let's get a line of credit, let's get a term loan, let's have opportunities available to us in the growth stage to be able to do certain bigger picture initiatives during that growth. And then from there, it was, what is the long-term vision, right? What's that next step that we wanted to take as an organization? And that's where the IPO conversations came into place of whether we wanted to explore a public offering. And with that, getting Big Four audited, bringing in an internal data function, really maturing the company to be able to take on that next step as more of a enterprise type company. So lots of things happened across that growth scale, a long-winded answer.
There's a lot to unpack there. And it's a product-based company too, which further creates more complexity for the organization. And Jesse, you sit on the side where you've got finance from a couple of angles. One, just as the product that you all offer, public markets, and then your internal finance function. When you started Sweater, how are you thinking about the internal finance function relative to the trajectory, the capital raising, the growth? How did you prepare for that? With a finance background, you were well equipped for that. Walk me through those first few phases.
I think the irony in my career so far is that I kind of don't like money, which is ironic given that I work in finance and everything that I do in my life on every side has to deal with fundraising. And I kind of despise it in many ways because money's not really important to me. And part of the reason that I got different finance degrees on the educational level was because I knew that I needed to understand it really, really well. And I wanted to be disciplined in it because it wasn't a natural thing for me to just count every penny and do all the things. And so from an education perspective, it was a forcing function. But then from a career perspective, I think that I kind of stumbled into a career of finance. And, so for me, I've worked in the world of startups now on a personal level for 16 or 17 years, on a professional level for 12 years. And I've worked inside venture capital funds. I've helped raise venture capital funds. Sweater itself has raised about 18 million in venture capital dollars to actually fund ourselves. And I've been in not every stage, but all of the earliest stages of operating a company where you have zero resources and you're trying to bootstrap everything yourself, to taking on outside capital and understanding that, to scaling it and how your mentality changes as money comes in the door and you have 10 or 12 million dollars sitting in a bank account and you have a responsibility to grow a company with that money sitting there and how you think about it. And that was a very interesting experience that I learned a lot from. And then on the flip side, we run these funds. So, we're a fintech infrastructure platform that actually hosts venture capital funds, but in a very specific context. And so the pilot fund that we launched raised about 15 million, made investments into 30 companies. And so that was sitting in a very different seat, looking at the financial requirements of a fund that has a lot of compliance complexities to it and has a lot of, frankly, risk exposures to doing stuff wrong. And so you really have to make sure that you are on top of your game and that you know the rules and that you have the right professionals surrounding you to advise you correctly. So I have seen it from a lot of different angles, and I feel like I've learned an awful lot in the last 5 years specifically, really going deep in all of these areas. And hopefully we can cover a few things today that are helpful for those that are in their own journeys.
What's interesting to me, yes, we'll dig into that, but given all of the experience you have in the finance realm, what you were doing and what Sweater is currently doing is novel to the industry. And planning for something that is disrupting an entire industry is very challenging. Was there anything in that process that you were like, all right, I feel like we're buttoned up, and then the next day you're like, oh no, we need to completely change our forecast, our trajectory? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the only guarantee with forecasting we joked about this, but the only guarantee with a forecast is that it's going to be wrong. And once you come to understand that, then you tend to look at it as a tool, as something to guide you and to be something that you measure yourself against, more so than this is a fact that we are going to achieve these things. And so to your point about like how often does that happen? Oh my gosh, it happens all the time. You know, I mean, I was just having this discussion this very week with one of our platform partners, because we had a major line item change underneath us, and they had the mentality that things were fixed in place. You know, and like this stuff doesn't change. And we'd been operating for years. We're like, oh, this stuff changes all the time. So when it happens, we're kind of like in the mentality of like, oh yeah, okay, so that has adjusted now. How does that change all these other things? Then you figure it out. But this client or partner really wasn't in that mentality yet. And we're frankly, you know, confidentially experiencing a little bit of friction in our relationship because of this change. And it's like, okay, like this is something that we need to learn together, that things change all the time. You can't lock finances in and say this is exactly the way it's going to be, because you have so many external factors that are driving against it. And so I'd say, I mean, like, yes, like recently, but also even years ago, looking at what was going to be required to even get us off the ground. I mean, we had so many variables coming at us all the time. One of the things, so we live in the world, let me just do a little bit of storytelling because you guys probably have no idea what we do. So let me just explain a little bit about what Sweater does. So there's two worlds of funds, professionally managed funds that exist out there. There's a world of private funds, which is like venture capital, private equity, private credit, like all that kind of stuff. Commercial real estate all live in these private funds. They're called Reg D funds. They have a lot of restrictions on them. You typically have to be very wealthy to participate in them, like writing $250,000, $500,000 checks if you're lucky to get in. There's like that whole world. And then there's the world of registered funds, which is mutual funds, ETFs, index funds that are open to anybody, but they have a ton of restrictions. It's sort of like the difference between running a private company versus running a public company from like a compliance and oversight perspective. So we were going after creating like this hybrid structure that allowed us to invest in the same private assets that venture capital funds and private equity funds invest in, but using an infrastructure, a compliance infrastructure of registered funds so that regular people could actually participate, and that the average, you know, or the minimum check to get in would be $500 instead of $250,000, and that you could have an unlimited number of investors. And no one had ever really done this in a meaningful way before, and we built this whole thing and we wrapped technology around it. But the thing that was so hard at the beginning was that there was no template. There was no one telling us, like even our attorneys didn't know. They're like, well, you know, like we're gonna go through this process with the SEC and then we're pretty sure this happens next. And then we get there and we're like, well, that's not what happens next. We just found out we gotta do these 3 other things. And then you're like running around in circles trying to organize all this stuff. And so part of the value that we created is that we figured that out, and we have sort of put a box around it to say, this is what it is, right? And now we can work with a partner to say, you wanna do one of these too? You can come in, you can leverage our technology, and then we're gonna be your partner, and we know how to do this. We know all the compliance stuff. And we know that it's very fungible and it moves all the time. But we're here, we've seen it before, and we'll help you through it, right? So just for a little bit more color, that's the world that I live in, and it is constantly changing.
So Jesse chose maybe one of the more complicated paths of startup land in the highly regulated, heavy compliance world. That's not the world that a lot of founders find themselves in, but a lot that you're talking about in terms of how you have to pivot, continually reforecast, rebudget, adjust your expectations, communicate with board investors, like that's a common thing that every startup faces. And so looking at your financial lens, looking through your business through a financial lens that you know is going to change, having alignment with investors who also understand that is incredibly important. And Stacey, I know in getting pop sockets up through viability, you all had a number of products and ideas that maybe didn't quite work out the way you thought. Did you all end up, first, let's hear about some of those products. And 2, did you end up developing a framework to help you think through decision-making on where to allocate dollars?
I want to say that, Jesse, once you stump your lawyers, you know you're onto something.
They get stumped more easily than you think. Yeah.
But yes, at PopSockets, we had fantastic margins, 90% plus gross margins. So in the early stages, we were hemorrhaging cash. So we had a lot of room to run with new product lines and get excited and let's take over the world and let's make these stick-on nails that kids are going to love. And I think what we did in that process or that growth stage is we got a little distracted. And it's very easy when you have a lot of capital available. You can relate it back to any startup that closes a raise, and right immediately thereafter it's kind of running and seeing what you can accomplish, but not really thinking about how thoroughly thinking through those decisions as you would if cash were tight. So I think that was our first, not necessarily a mistake, it was just the nature of the business that we got really excited and grew pretty quickly. But what that led to is some mistakes in planning and decision making. What we didn't do was plan the product, test the product, execute the product. And we can talk about that with the nails and execution, but one of the more memorable kind of mistakes that we made was a product improvement. So you think about like even an iPhone, like you're going from the 15 to the 16. Most people in market are gonna either probably get a discounted 15 or they're gonna get the 16 and get the new one. So we kind of did that with the Grip, where we improved the product, but we didn't quite think through the execution in store where the consumers were consuming the product. So if you think about it, you can do it many different ways, but what we decided to do was take all of the product of the old version off the shelves in store. We're talking Verizon, Walmart, all big box, Amazon, taking it back off of shelf. Now what that means is we have to pay for that shipping, we have to pay for the product that they already paid us for, so we're refunding their customers. And then we also have to discount the inventory once we take it back. So is it obsolete once we have it back in our warehouse? Can we sell it? So overall, that whole return process was well over $14 million for us to just execute across the board. And a lot of it was because the product and the sales team were making these decisions without a full financial impact, not necessarily working in tandem with the finance team to understand the impact from a financial perspective of how much that's going to cost the company. So all of that to say, it's really important to go hand in hand and make these decisions fully thought through. Have a plan and a process of how is it, what are the ideation stage, how are we going to test it, see what's going to work, and then thoughtfully executing on that.
It's so interesting to see the ripple effect of what a decision can make relative to a product and how those ancillary and tertiary financial impacts come to life after you see the impact of what decision you made. And oftentimes it's so difficult to plan for all of that, and so if you're in the planning process, conservatively estimating some of those impacts in terms of the higher dollar expenditure may be a good move just to cover some of those things. Now that might be an extraordinary circumstance where you just truly couldn't plan a full, kind of recall of all the product, but it's tough to plan for. Jesse, I'm curious, when you all raised capital for the business, you're late 21, early 22, things are good in VC, money is flowing, you're on top of the world. I want to hear a little bit about your mindset at that point in time, post-capital raise.
Yeah, so we maybe separate what we do a little bit, right? So, first of all, we're a venture-backed fintech company, right? So we've raised money to capitalize our business from venture capital funds and from angel syndicates to actually run the business. And then outside of that, we have these actual funds that we raise money into that have their own cycles and their own P&Ls and all this stuff, and we operate those. But that's different than our operating company. So just to be clear, so Roman is asking about us as a venture-backed company. So yeah, it was sort of like one of those situations where we went from having nothing, no dollars, like $50,000 in credit card debt to try to get this thing off the ground on our own, to getting to the point where we were venture-backed and I had $12 million sitting in the bank, right? And it's a really weird experience to go from having $0 or negative dollars in the bank to having a whole bunch of money sitting in the bank. And the mentality, it was a weird time. I don't know if anyone else in here was fundraising in 2020 and 2021, but it was peak hype, right? Just like hype on top of hype on top of hype. And when you go back and look at all the charts, Well, and I should say, if anyone's following this market now, everything has gone through a reset over the last 18 to 24 months. Complete reset. It's a completely different world. And when you go back and look at the charts of like the number of dollars that were invested into companies from VC funds and the number of deals done, those both peaked in Q1 of 2022, which is exactly when we raised our seed round, in that very peak moment. And so I'm grateful for it because we needed the money, and in any other environment, we couldn't have raised enough money to have achieved what we achieved. So I'm thankful for it. But at the same time, it puts you in a really weird headspace when money is out there and it's flowing. And I remember having this conversation, maybe like Q3 of 2022. We still had like $9 or $10 million in the bank. And my mentality at the time was, oh, we'll just go raise more money. And, it's like, if we need something, we'll just raise more money. Just raise more money. I mean, it's just hilarious thinking back at that, because today, man, we have 20 times the traction and the validation of what we're doing, and yet it is so hard to get anybody to write a check today. And so it's one of those things where it's like you really have to read the room of the environment that you're in. And we found ourselves like making weird decisions. And I think back on some of the conversations that we had, and I still remember saying out loud, I can't believe I said these words out loud, but saying the words like, oh, that's only $500,000. It's not that big of a deal. Why are we complaining about this? And today, what I would do for an extra $500,000 to magically show up in my bank account, or 500 grand that I didn't spend a year and a half ago or 2 years ago that I still had today. And it's weird having this experience of having a block of money. It's like a big block of ice, and every day you go in and you chip off a piece of ice and you put it in your drink, right? And you use it, right? And you can never get it back, it's gone. And every day you're chipping that thing down, and at the beginning it's like you're not even making a dent, And you get more confident, and the next day you chunk off a big old chunk of ice, and you're like, look at all this ice I still got left, Until you realize that you can't get more ice. And then all of a sudden you're looking at it and you're like, oh my gosh, like if I keep doing this, the ice is gonna be gone. And then you change your mentality and you have to change the way you operate. And those are painful conversations, because typically by the time you realize that, you're out over your skis, and cutting it back to make it fit, that's painful, because it usually involves people. And that is the hardest part about operating a business, is having to look somebody in the eye that you hired because you love them, you love their skill set and the impact they're having on the business, but you know that you can't have them there anymore, and you have to make that hard decision, have that hard conversation. It's the worst place ever. And so those were tough conversations for me to have, and things for me to realize, and that's just one financial example.
It's so interesting, and I like the analogy of the ice block. I've heard it also said, an analogy to a tube of toothpaste, right? When you get a new tube of toothpaste, it's brand new, you don't even think about it, you just layer it on. But then as you get towards the end there, you're just like squeezing every last bit out of it. You'll buy devices to get the most out of this tube of toothpaste, and it's just like a startup, man. Like it's wild. But it seems to ring true, and I think it's important to continue to manage as if you have nothing in a lot of ways when you are capital strong. And so considering that in the early days at PopSocket, you guys weren't outside capitalized, but you had these great margins, you're making decisions on product, you're scaling a team. Like, how were you all making decisions? Did you have enough data? Did you have a team around you? What did that kind of early inflection point look like?
It was a mess. It was such a mess. I mean, think about startups that are growing quick. Everything is a mess all the time. So to mature that took a very long time. Early years, I want to say third year of business, we explored a potential investment, partial sale of the company. And at that time, we couldn't answer the question of how many grips have you sold. And that's because our internal data had grips in so many different formats. We sold it to this customer in packs of 2. We sold it on the website in packs of 1. We have it in raw materials over here. So to combine all that data and aggregate it into answering the question of how many have you sold, which is such a simple question, it took months to build out the model to do that. So we think about today, everything is easier in hindsight. But working now with a lot of different startups that are just getting started, I always like to emphasize the importance of the data strategy. Think of your data as if you're going to scale. Invest in it in a way that you can get the reporting out that you're going to need when you're 10 times bigger than you are today. Start shifting that mindset to be able to answer those sorts of questions. So it'll make your life a heck of a lot easier when you do have to, on a dime, answer those questions. But through that growth stage, having a financial team, FP&A team, kind of building out the model. Jesse mentioned too, your model is never right, but the more important thing about building a budget, building a forecast, is you're learning what the inputs are, and then you're learning what you got wrong. And that's almost as important as getting it right, is learning, okay, we expected revenues to be this value. Where did we miss? Or where are we off on margin? That's where I didn't understand that our product cost that much. You're learning through that pain, throughout the different steps in the process, to allow you to just get better over time, understand your business more, whether that's from a founder lens, if you're doing it early stages, just at a solo level, or 100 million size company.
Can I jump in on that? Because this is something I'm very passionate about, is forecasting. And how about the intersection of forecasting, whether or not you do it and how well you do it, and then this other spectrum that goes against it, which is like investors and how much they care about it, and they love it, or they tell you that it's the worst thing ever and it's a waste of time. This is an area I have a lot of passion, because just to your point, the forecast will never be right. But by going through the process of creating the forecast, you are forced to think through all of the dynamics of your business that drive the financial factors of what your reality could be. And by doing that, you are automatically going to be smarter about your business. And every time one of those variables comes up in your business, you now have this thing sitting in the back of your head of all the other variables that are tied to it and how it could change and affect your business. And so while the investors that say, no, it's a waste of time, are correct that the numbers will not be right, and that's not the way your business is exactly going to turn out, what they are missing is that it is going to make you smart, and that they are missing that you understand your business better than someone who is just flying by the seat of their pants and checking their bank account balance every other week to see how much money's left, right? And you will be a better founder, and you will be better at running your business if you take the time and the effort to build out financial forecasts and understand them, not outsource it, mind you, and pay someone else to do it and give you an answer, because that doesn't do the same thing. But actually being part of building it, making the decisions, understanding what those variables are like, and then if you're really smart, you'll track your business against it.
And what's nice about that is it helps you understand what levers to pull and what the impact those lever pulling has on the business. And it's far more approachable today than it was even 3 years ago, 5 years ago. You don't have to be an Excel wizard to understand what levers you can pull that impact your business. There's a lot of software out there that can really help you hone in on that. One element that I want to hit on as well is that Stacey mentioned data infrastructure, and accounting, finance, it's a data equation, and you need to have clean inputs in order to yield a clean output. And one of my favorite quotes on the data side of things comes from DJ Patil, who is the chief data scientist under the Obama administration. And he said, as it relates to your data strategy, you need to look to build for 1x, you need to prototype for 10x, or prototype for 1x, build for 10x, and then engineer for 100x. And I think that's a really powerful statement when you think about it through the lens of startup building. You can Google it. It might be a little slightly different, but it's we're on point there. So think about data infrastructure. Think about how that impacts things like forecasting. It is a tremendously quality exercise to go through. Stacey, you had mentioned IPO. Jesse, I know you have some experience in alternative capital sources. I'm curious, Stacey, during your tenure at PopSockets, as you all started to think about a potential IPO, like IPO is the top of the top, right? That's where everybody wants to get. How did you guys think about that? What process did you go through? And then ultimately, what decision was made?
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. I think I'll start with the biggest mistake. The biggest mistake we made is that we didn't have that long-term plan in mind. The IPO was a pie-in-the-sky idea that because all of these other Warby Parkers, product-based companies are going public, we need to go public too. What we didn't have is the why. You know, you typically you're going IPO to raise capital, right? But then we couldn't answer the question, well, what are we going to do with that capital? What are the goals after that point? Are we going to expand the product line? Are we going to grow into new markets? We didn't have that defined. And so I think even if you're thinking about that from an IPO, large scale, down to a single member company, you need to know your why. You need to know what you're working toward so you can back into the steps that you're taking today. Otherwise, otherwise you're gonna get distracted. And that's what happened. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building up the infrastructure of the company to improve legal, to improve tax, to improve accounting, Big Four auditors, to bring in incredibly talented people to scale the business. But we didn't have that North Star of where we were going and why. So we were just spending money for the sake of spending money. So rather than what we did through the process, I think it's just most important to know why you're doing it.
One sidebar on that, you mentioned having to spend a lot of money to go through this process. One of them included a financial audit. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I would recommend pushing back on that if investors or other people, want you to get one. That's a different conversation for a different time. But you're right. Like drilling down to the why, I think, is so important, particularly through the lens of building a startup, because it's so easy to get sucked into the venture mindset of we got to build a unicorn or it's a bust. And honestly, today it's so much more accessible to build a startup that suits your lifestyle, and you don't have to grow at all costs. If you can build something that allows you to enjoy your life more, to spend more time with the things that you love, like that's success. And so don't get too, starstruck by this bar that's set by social media, that's set by LinkedIn. I think that can be a really easy trap to fall into. Continue on. Go ahead.
I want to hit on the audit piece for a second because I don't know too much about the audience here and what kind of size.
Any auditors?
Any auditors? I'm actually not going to bash audit for this example, but like I mentioned, you need to know where you're going. If you're going to be a solopreneur in a small company, that's great. Stay there. If you want to grow your company and you're intending to be a billion-dollar company, start thinking about your finances from day one. Make sure you have strong accountants in place. Make sure you have a strong financial team in place. Otherwise, once you hit that critical mass of whatever the metric is, $1 million in revenue, it's going to be a lot more painful to go back and clean that up versus having it right from the start and being able to have those metrics, have those answers, take that deal from the investor because they're asking you XYZ data. You have the answers available if you've been building it in the right way. Sometimes that comes along with needing to get an audit, right? If you reach a critical point where you're getting an investment from a banker, they're requiring a financial audit. Can you get through that easily? Do you have the data right? Have you been thinking about the correctness of your financials all along because you knew that you wanted to get to that point where it would be important? Align those now versus having an audit because you're a two-person company and someone told you need to get an audit. I don't think that's very valuable at that point. But having that alignment is very critical.
It goes along the lines of starting with the end in mind, right? I think it's really helpful to have that goal setting for the business. Although you got to be careful though, because that may put blinders on for opportunities that exist along the path. So always good to have that goal setting strategy. So continuing down the path of capital, IPO, different options. Jesse, you're also passionate about, know a lot about crowdfunding and alternative forms of capital. What's your experience in that space? What are your thoughts? Would you advise people to go through that process?
I think it's like different types of capital sources or like different types of cuisines. It's sort of like a little bit of an acquired taste, or you got to learn to understand it in order to like it. So like venture capital is obviously one. Angel investors are one. Equity crowdfunding is one. Banks and financial institutions are one. And there's a lot of different ways that you can structure to finance your company. And I do want to emphasize a point that you made earlier, Roman, is that being venture-backed or going down a venture-backed path should not be the end-all, be-all, only worthy way to build a company. And I, for a long time, kind of viewed it that way, that it's like, well, I'm only a good entrepreneur if I go and pursue venture capital, obviously. Otherwise, I'm running a crappy lifestyle business. And what's to be proud of for running a lifestyle business? And I just have to say, that's complete bullshit. Absolutely, utterly. As a founder, this is me as a founder talking to anyone else who's thinking about themselves as a founder. The venture-backed path fits for a very small percentage of companies that have the right market dynamics and product fit out in the market and the ability almost for the market to suck them up that path. If you try to force yourself down that path, you might be able to raise money and get yourself onto it, but then there's a good chance you're going to wish you weren't on it anymore. Because once you are no longer winning at that game, you will be completely ignored and it could destroy your business. It most likely will. And there are so many other ways to build a business and to successfully get the capital that you may or may not need in order to get going. And I think that's another big folly, is that you have to go out and get capital in order to build a business. And that is not necessarily the order of events in the way that it has to take place. So like specific to channels, we are venture backed. You know, we've received checks from 5 or 6 VC funds, but to date we've raised almost $20 million, and maybe $3 million of that is from VC funds. The rest of the money has come from angels and angel syndicates, and a portion of it has come from equity crowdfunding. And so, I mean, like, if you're out looking for capital, one of my favorite things that I've learned over the last 5 years doing this is that syndicates and SPVs, or special purpose vehicles, are a wonderful way to bring capital into your business in a very clean way. If you're not familiar with that world, I highly suggest that you get educated on it. We have probably a dozen different syndicate groups that have come in and put together chunks of money from $150,000 up to $1.2 million in different groups. And one of the reasons that syndicates and SPVs are really beneficial as a company is that it's basically like a company that's formed, and they gather all these small checks together and put it in that company, and then that company makes one investment in your company. So on your cap table, it just shows one investor, which is really important. But that company could have 50 investors in it, right? And so you don't want 50 investors to line up on your cap table from that one group, much less from a dozen groups, right? And have hundreds of people on your cap table. Like, it's very messy. Whether you're venture backed or not, you don't want that many people on your cap table. So SPVs are great, and it's a good way as well to get someone to champion your company and leverage their relationships and the trust that they have with other people who could write checks to basically pitch your company on your behalf. And they've made a commitment of $25,000, and now they go out to their buddies and are like, hey, I'm doing this. You should put in 10 or 20 grand too. Come join me. And that's a very different pitching experience and fundraising experience than just trying to talk to a gajillion individual investors on your own. It accelerates things, and it's a smart way to raise money, and we've done a lot of that. Another channel that also has some strings attached, or maybe cables attached, could be a different way to think about it, is equity crowdfunding. So you're probably familiar with Start Engine and WeFunder and Republic and some of these platforms that are out there that allow you to raise from anybody. So in the SPVs, you have to be an accredited investor to participate in those. And in equity crowdfunding, you don't have to raise just from accredited investors. And you can also go out and publicly solicit. You know, you can run ads, and you can talk about it on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever it's called now, X. And you can actually be out and be very public about it. But there are a lot of strings attached to it that make it kind of difficult. So we've raised about $1.5 million in equity crowdfunding to date. We did one that was quasi-independent, and then we're doing one that's wrapping up here in about 5 or 6 weeks on Start Engine. And it's a great way to engage your community. I think that that's probably the biggest benefit from it, is that if you have a base of customers and people that believe in what you're doing, you're giving them a chance to actually own part of the company instead of just buying the product. And there's something very powerful about that. And I would say that's the number one reason I would encourage anyone to do it. If you quote unquote, can't raise money, and then you're thinking about doing equity crowdfunding, I would think twice about whether or not that's the right path. Because you still got to bring people to the table. It's really quite expensive, like spending 15 to 20% of every dollar you raise goes to actually paying to do the thing, right? So for all intents and purposes, it's quite expensive. And it is extraordinarily time consuming. So time consuming. I mean, like, just getting the thing off the ground is probably going to take you 8 to 12 weeks of spending like 15 to 20 hours a week just organizing things to get through the registration process to even be able to do it. And then you're spending like half your time just marketing it and trying to get people to invest and guiding it in. Do not fall for the guys that if you just list on Start Engine that you're going to raise $500,000. That is absolutely not the way it works. We brought, like, just to give you context, we brought like $300,000 within the first 7 days into our Start Engine campaign. And we hit a bunch of milestones that they put out there. And they told us, we've got 500,000 active investors. And once you hit this milestone, we'll give you a dedicated email and we'll promote it to these 500,000 investors. I bet that we could raise another $1 million or $2 million for you. And that email went out and they brought in $35,000. So it is a place to go, but it is not the place to go. It is very expensive and time consuming and very distracting when you could just be running a business, right? And going out and spending that money that you would have spent to get the thing off the ground to actually get customers, strangely enough, and actually drive revenue for your business, which inherently will attract more of everything. So long answer, and there's lots more options out there, but those are probably the biggest ones.
No, it's a great overview. There's so many options available today, and it's hard to know what path to go down as a founder. Okay, Stacy, last question, then I'll open up Q&A. Let's go back to basics. If you're starting a company today, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you would recommend to somebody to set up their accounting and financial infrastructure in a really, really strong way?
From day one, segregating your business from your personal expenses, having everything tracked in your company, separate from personal.
Yes, please do that.
Learning from mistakes there. From there, if you have transactional volume, you want softwares to automate everything as much as possible. There's so many great tools in market now from an accounting and finance perspective. Roman alluded to a few on the forecasting side, but tools that automate credit card spend, like Ramp. Ramp is a great platform that automates credit card and bill pay spend. You're putting all of your outbound money through one software, so you can see what you owe and when you owe it. Having centralization and visibility is incredibly helpful that way. Financial software, GL system like a QuickBooks, if possible, a banking relationship. Find a banker that you can rely on, whether it's a small kind of high yield account like a Mercury who has 5% yield on savings accounts. But keeping it very simple on the early stages. And from there, it comes out of necessity. Where are your gaps? What can't you see very well, right? What questions can't you answer? Tools can help you close that gap over time.
Nice, thank you. All right, we've got 8 minutes here open for Q&A. Any questions out there?
Right here.
Oh, hi, yes, hi. I'll repeat your question.
So I think my question is to Jesse. You mentioned earlier the fundraising and the ICE fund. So apparently it gets harder and harder for a startup to get more funding as they kind of age or matures. So would you suggest it's recommended to basically fund as much money as possible as you're still pre-seed, seed, or it doesn't matter if you get to Series A? So what would be the best stage to basically get all the cash?
So to repeat that, if that's all right, is basically, should you maximize how much you raise at the beginning so you can raise less later, knowing that it may not be guaranteed? That's a great question, and I think there's a lot of nuance inside how you think about doing that. Because on one hand, especially if you are thinking in a venture context or an angel investor context of raising money that way, you're going to automatically be living inside a set of parameters or constraints from the investor's perspective, saying, how much is your company worth, right? So today, early stage pre-money valuations are amazing. I mean, 12 years ago when I started professionally in the industry, seed stage rounds were average pre-money at $3.5 million. Today, average pre-money is 12. It's incredible. It's totally a different time period to start a company like it is today. However, when you talk about trying to maximize how much you raise, I don't know if that's necessarily the right mentality, because there's a balance that you have to take between how much money you raise and having cash in the bank and dilution, and also setting yourself up for the next round. Because let's just say that you want to raise $5 million and you have someone telling you that they want to give you $5 million. Well, if you don't want to dilute to crap, then you're probably going to have a pre-money valuation of like at least 15 or maybe higher, which is going to put your post-money valuation at like 20 or 22 million, something like that, right? Now that is a different challenge, because what you just did is you just raised your bar from being here, because it's like your bar is right here that you're about to jump over. Your next round has to jump higher than that, right? So if your last post-money valuation was at 20 million, and now you're going to go raise your next round, your investors are going to expect your next post-money to be at 45 or 50 or 60 million in order for it to qualify, right? So now what you have to achieve with the additional money that you raised is much higher than what you would have had to achieve if you've raised 3 money at a $15 million post-money valuation. If you kind of follow, I know I'm throwing around a lot of numbers, but basically every time you raise more money, you are raising the bar that you have to jump over next time, which actually increases your risk from a fundraising perspective. And so I'm a huge advocate of being as lean as possible and saying, what do we really have to do to achieve what we have to? And being very disciplined with that initial block of ice that you get. Not waste it, not try to run too hard, not try to experiment with too many things, but be very, very focused and accomplish as much as you possibly can, because it will actually be easier to raise your next round of funding if your valuation bands that you find yourself in are in balance with what the market expects. And like something that happened with Sweater, at late 21, early 22, was that those bands were massive. Like we raised a $12.5 million seed round at a $48 million post-money valuation. Freaking insane. I can't believe that I allowed me and my team to do that. Because what it did was it raised our bar freaking clear up here. And it made it very, very difficult for us to have to manage that later. And yes, I brought in $12.5 million in a massive block of ice that we got to chip away at. But there was also an enormous amount of pressure to make big things happen with that amount of money. And we made big things happen, but what happened underneath us was that the market shifted. And those bands also shifted, which put us kind of out in a no-go zone, which was very, very difficult. And that's the part you cannot control. And so you want to try to keep yourself in a controllable space. Anyways, that was a long answer.
No, it's great. It's great.
Great question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that starting a business like back in the day is much different than it is now. What are some changes you see happening right now that you think could impact how starting a business?
Yeah, so the question was, it was a lot different starting a business a long time ago. What are the changes that have occurred that create the environment of starting a business today? What has changed over the last number of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing is that it's easier than ever to build a product. The bar is lower than it's ever been to get a company off the ground, and to be able to do it with a very small amount of capital and the right people with the right skill sets to get it done. If you really start digging into the AI capabilities that are out there, you can build an awful lot with no money, which is a massive advantage to the founders in the room, because you can make more happen with less money and get further along with your validation cycle, which will allow you to raise more money in a better way. So I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that the bar is lower to actually be able to build something. I mean, if you go back not 10 years ago, but 20 years ago or 25 years ago in the late 90s, early 2000s, good golly. I mean, like, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't even like prototype something for less than $1 million. It was wildly different period of time. So today I'd say that's probably the biggest difference that is in our advantage as founders. There's also more money available than there has ever been in the world of venture. But that money is very fickle and very distractible. And the big distraction right now, ironically, is AI, right? So money's starting to come back into the market, but if you really break it down by where the money's going, it's into pure play, like fresh foundation AI startups. And so everybody else is kind of left with the scraps, right? So there's a lot of money, but it moves and it shifts according to whatever's happening in the market. And so you can't really build your business around that, right? Because there's always going to be money slushing around the ecosystem in some way. Whether or not it's sloshing in your direction is more a moment in time thing than a permanency thing.
It's a lot easier to ship really bad product too, so that product market fit becomes far more important.
That's also very true.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Stacy. I know you mentioned it was important to focus on your data collection as you grow. Are there any certain KPIs or data points that you would be particularly focused on when going about and figuring out the best way to go collect some of this data?
When I think about data strategy, let me repeat that. The question was, are we thinking about certain KPIs and metrics when we're thinking about collecting our data to centralize a data strategy? The data collection is mostly important to have that centralized visibility across your business. You don't want to have a sales report that says one thing and a finance report that says another. Centralizing that so you know the answer of what is your CAC, what is your LTV. You don't have to translate how it says it in your financial statements versus what maybe your online software tool says. You need that data to be consistent. So when we think about data strategy, we think about building all of those inputs into a central warehouse. And so it's aggregating all of that together to answer that one question based on all of those inputs. There's plenty of different metrics that exist across different companies that, depending on SaaS, product, and there's core ones that companies are always leveraging. But I think from a data side, it's more making sure the answer is the same across all of the sources.
Can I just add one last thing to that? Just not so much in data gathering as in the metric to track. At the earliest stages, by far the most important thing is your CAC to LTV ratio, so your cost of acquisition on a per unit economics basis to the lifetime value of any given whatever you're selling. That's by far the most important thing. So gathering the data so that it feeds you and you understand what it actually is. And screw the investors, this is for you. As the entrepreneur that's trying to make a business work, and the nature of what is correct in that CAC to LTV ratio shifts dramatically based on the industry that you're in. And so you've got to be very smart on that and make sure that you're gathering the data to feed it correctly.
Thank you for the questions. I wish we had time for more, but we have to pause here. You can find Jesse, Stacy, or myself on LinkedIn. Ask any follow-up questions there. We'll be hanging out after this. Give these two a great round of applause.